I am now rudely interrupting the song. Apologies for that, but my guest, Busi Sibeko, has joined me. And as promised, since we are a talk platform, we talk more and sometimes play less music. But you are still listening to Capital Radio's The More Music Station, and our frequency is 88.1 FM. If you are joining us from anywhere around the world, we say hello, sawubona, konnichiwa. Is it bonjour or bon voyage? I think it's bonjour. Let me leave other languages and welcome Busi Sibeko.
Bonjour.
Oh, it's bonjour. Let me not bite my tongue. I once had a manager or a boss who was a French national who now lived in SA, and she used to hate speaking her mother tongue, but I loved it in any case. So thank you so much, Busi, for the correction. How do you do today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for taking time out of your super hectic schedule to be with us here at Capital Radio and enjoy this needful conversation which we're now going to embark on. It's quite critical because I feel that so many people in SA, I'm not saying this to look down on them, but I feel that so many numbers or jargon that is said by the Minister of Finance is oftentimes not left for criticism, or nobody gives us time to unpack it further and understand what does it mean for the ordinary person on the street. And I want us to have this conversation so that at least we can zone into the issues that we may have missed. Because I think most often when there's a budget speech, we often look at the fashion at the parliament precinct, and then we look at what he says, we pick up a few things that we understand, but not what it then becomes from a practicality point of view. Please kindly introduce yourself to our audiences, and then we officially zoom into the conversation.
Yeah, hi. No, thank you for having me here. I'm Busi Sibeko, and I'm a researcher and budget policy lead at the Institute for Economic Justice. I'm also trained economist by training, and so and mostly work on the budget. But yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what you're saying, that part of the reason why people aren't able to engage is because the budget isn't really written for the average citizen, right? It's actually by design. To appease the markets, the credit ratings agencies, and we're going to discuss this later, but to say that, these are some of the critical conversations we must have about, participation and transparency. How do we get more people, involved, but also how can our budget speak more to our people so that they can also understand and engage it further?
Definitely. We often hear of monetary policy, we hear of economic trajectory, we see things that are said or suggested, and so oftentimes we don't really understand what these are and how do they get formed. Maybe as a way of introduction, just give us a sense of why is there a need for a budget speech? How then does it filter through to affecting our daily lives and activities?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So the national budget in South Africa is effectively to show us what the country's priorities are, where government will be spending. So what government spends and tax policy is called fiscal policy. And so monetary policy is done by the South African Reserve Bank, but the budget is our fiscal policy for the year. And so it's supposed to show us, where their priorities lie, where we are going, how they're going to spend to improve our society ultimately, but also fundamentally how they're going to spend to protect human rights. Right, it is in the Constitution of South Africa that we've got rights to, we've got rights, and so the National Treasury, which is the entity that puts together the budget, is not above the Constitution. There's in fact Chapter 17, I think, talks about the role of this entities of managing the finances of the state in a way that is that is responsible, that takes care of the people inside. And so what does that mean for you and me? It means, there are goods that are provisioned by the state, right? Like public clinics, we know that, public schools, anything that we know that is public. This budget is telling us how much money is going to be channeled into providing that public good or service. So that's what it means for us on a day-to-day. But also, I think it's got bigger implications because how our government spends has a direct impact on the economy itself, right? So if our government does not spend in a way that rather grows our economy, it obviously means that we're going to have less jobs. It means that there'll be less general wealth and so forth. So the budget is not only policy around spend and tax, but also fundamentally about, the contribution to the economy. 30% of our GDP is government expenditure. And so it's a very big component of, the economic opportunities we have as people in this country as well.
Definitely. We're also going to touch briefly on how this 30% translates to government being presumably one of the highest employers in SA, and how this leads to lack of service delivery. But maybe let's go into the sentiment that I deduced from the budget speech was that it was pro-business and anti-poor. Is there merit to this sentiment?
Absolutely. As we've called as the Budget Justice Coalition, but also a group of organizations, more than 200 organizations have signed a petition basically asking for Parliament to reject this budget. And the reason why we're saying it's anti-poor, it's because fundamentally we're going to see massive cuts to public expenditure. So let me just give you, like, for instance, in the budget themselves, they acknowledge that in real terms, and so when I say real terms, it means inflation adjusted. You're going to see cuts of 5.2% in non-interest expenditure, and non-interest expenditure has everything but debt. So they're going to be cutting, they are cutting health, education, even the grants. 10 Rand increases are below the inflationary increase. So it's actually a decrease over time. And so we're seeing massive cuts there. And I think I'll just pull up some of the real numbers for you to see. And obviously that has a direct bearing on our rights. For instance, they'll be cutting, I think it's 50.3 billion from the health budget over the next 3 years. So you can already imagine a country where majority, 83% of us rely on the public healthcare system, what that does to, access, what that does in terms of, our long lines that we wait, that we all know. If you live in a township, there's long lines at the clinic to see doctors, to see nurses. But also importantly, medical price inflation is higher than normal inflation. So it just means we're going to be able to afford less and less and less of the medicines, of the staff, because again, remember, there's going to be public wage freezes, all right? And so we're going to see a lot of vacancies. I think in 2018, South Africa had 38,000 vacant posts in healthcare. That was in 2018. COVID came, obviously there was some boosting of there was some more people hired, but at the same time, it's not nearly, as many people as that actually needed to make our health service deliver quality health to all, all South Africans. But we're seeing cuts. I mean, you've seen the protests happening around NSFAS. It's access to tertiary education. When we're looking at schools, the National Treasury themselves acknowledge that the cuts to the compensation bill are going to lead to a shortage of teachers. And this is going to lead to, overcrowded classrooms, especially no fee paying schools. So do you see, when our National Treasury acknowledges that their decision is going to impact a certain group of people who we already know are disadvantaged more, right? And they're saying, we're going ahead with this cut anyway, even though we know that it's going to have negative learning outcomes for those students. And so, so in a lot of ways, there's massive cuts to our basic services. And they've acknowledged this for a long time. In every budget, they say we're going to have fiscal consolidation, which is cuts. And they say, this will obviously impact growth, and it'll impact basic service delivery. And so that's why it's anti-poor, because the burden of trying to resolve quote unquote our debt issues is falling on those who rely on public services more, and women in particular, a subgroup that we should always be aware of, because they're the ones who provision the social reproduction, the unpaid care work, and so they rely on these public services more. And so when you cut away those services, they are disproportionately impacted. But on the flip side, we know high income earners and the wealthy got more rebates, so getting returns on medical aid, more returns on provident funds. But we know people who are poor in this country can't afford that. So they're not going to benefit from that disproportionately. But also Treasury is proposing a corporate income tax cut. They're telling us they can't afford, but then they're also saying, corporates, you guys can pay less tax. So it's a bit it's contradictory in its stance, and that's why we're calling it anti-poor, and it's pro-wealth. And I think fundamentally, what government has shown in this budget is that they're stepping back and allowing for private sector to lead the way, in a way, so to speak. So they are enabling private sector to do the heavy lifting, but that is not the role of the state. The role of the state is to provision, to protect human rights and to progressively realize them. And in this budget, they're going to regress them, you know, and I think also just to take a step back to say this is in a context of cuts over time. This is not the first time we've seen cuts in these sectors. We've been talking about this since, you know, we've been saying since 2014-15, government has been systematically reducing how much they spend per person in real terms on various sectors, health, education. You'll see that with education, Nick Spall does this research that shows that the education, I think the budget has decreased per learner by 8% over the last decade or so. So it's been slow, you know, like those decisions. And even though the budget looks like it's growing, right? Like, so when people have been looking at it 2014, you're like, the budget is growing, but actually what's happening is per person spend is declining. And debt servicing costs are obviously the fastest growing item on the budget.
Whilst you're still touching on the idea of debt, we've heard recently of the term 9 wasted years, in inverted commas. I'm not sure what got wasted in those 9 years I was in there. I definitely didn't do the wasting. But in those but in those 9 wasted years, I do not recall South Africa running to the IMF, the World Bank, and I didn't enjoy or see as much acrimony as we have now with the ratings agencies, right? So if you were to just elucidate this point further by giving us the actual numbers, what is it about this 9 wasted years and this association we now have with the IMF, the World Bank, and this degree of indebtedness?
Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting. Debt has been steadily increasing in South Africa since the financial crisis. And I think here it's important for your listeners to distinguish between absolute debt is not the problem, right? Like, so the first thing is important is people mustn't think of the national budget as a household budget. That's the first and most important thing. It's not like a household budget, right? One, because the state has fiscal policy and has monetary policy, right? The state can print money. You can't do that in your household.
Yes.
The state has more tools. They can borrow from their citizens, you know, at a cheaper rate than, you know, we borrow from the banks. And, you know, so there's many ways in which the state itself is not like a household budget. And so we need to distinguish between total debt, which is measured as debt to GDP, and debt servicing costs. And debt servicing costs is, you know, our payments on the debt itself. So South Africa's steadily been increasing, you know, debt, and it's a global phenomenon. It's not just a South Africa only issue. Since the financial crisis, many countries around the world, their debt has increased, right? And so the problem is our government is using debt, the total debt, as a way to moralize us into thinking that there's no alternative to this austerity budget, which is the cuts and the regressive taxes. But I mean, you look at other countries, there are countries that have 200% debt to GDP ratio, right? Your Japan's, your USA, way over 100, right? And so it's not the total debt. It's actually your ability to change the denominator, which is GDP, because it's debt to GDP. So because we haven't grown over the last 10 years, right? Because we're barely growing, like 1.1%, 1.2%, like we are barely growing. That's why it's becoming an emerging issue, because, right, to service your debt, it also means you need to be growing to be able to increase your budget. For, you know, we saying both are needed. You need GDP growth to be able to service your debt and to deliver on human rights. Both are required. And the strategies that we've had, that's also the problem. The problem is that part of it is that the strategies we've had for growth are just not the right tools. We're not implementing the right tools to grow as an economy. You know, we've always had neoliberal approaches, and by neoliberalism, you know, we're talking about stabilizing debt to GDP has always been a thing. You know, there's what do you call it? Privatization, there's, you know, liberalization of markets and rationalization. And so actually where we are right now is austerity's neoliberal dreams come true. It is a tool that enforces neoliberalism, the desire to shrink the size of the state,
Yes.
and its involvement. And so that's literally what we're seeing before our eyes, right? The state is saying, we're going to contract, we're going to have less workers. That's the fundamental thing, right? The public sector wage bill is not just the public sector wage bill is big. No, it's deeply ideological. From which position are you coming from? Because people are not saying, is this public sector wage bill delivering on the human rights of South Africa as we need? People are just saying the wage bill is too big.
Yes.
Do you see? So fundamentally with this issue of debt in South Africa, even over the 9 years, whatever, our debt did increase, obviously over time. Actually, when you look back in the budget, you first find fiscal consolidation in 2012. So already in 2012, they were telling us they're going to deal with our rising debt. Back then, our debt was probably like 25% to GDP. Already. So it was still at the 25, they were telling us we're going to, cut back this debt, we're going to reduce the debt. And so fundamentally, I think part of the issue is accountability. Yeah. There's been a lack of resolving the debt issue for a long time. And so now there's a socializing of failure. We are the ones having to suffer, to deal with the failure to rein in that debt all along, or to do something different so that we wouldn't be where we are. And so, so obviously with the international institutions, they are very much obsessed with debt stabilization. And not to say it's not important, it is important. We've got debt, we have to pay it. It's not like we can just say, guys, sorry, bye, we're not going to pay this debt. We can't say that. I wish we could. But at the same time, the way that it's being mobilized and weaponized as a way to implement this fiscal consolidation is the problem. And so with the, obviously we had Iscom debt, when Iscom is a contingent liability on the budget. And what that means is that if Iscom fails to pay, so the national treasury has to pay. So that's a real threat. I think SOEs remain a real threat to our budget servicing costs, because it's almost like a guaranteed, we will pay their debt if they are unable to. And so that remains a key concern. And I think, even the international credit agencies raised that one, have been raising it for a long time. In terms of though, our debt composition is 90% South African rands. It's actually only 10% foreign denominated debt. So there's also this big hoo-ha around, like, what if the rand falls? But it's like, it's only 10% of our debt. Yes, it's significant, it's important. Yes, but then there are other tools. When you have your debt in your local currencies, there are other monetary policy tools that you could use to cheapen borrowing. South African Reserve Bank last year did that effectively. They managed to reduce the cost of borrowing for themselves. And so I think the whole debt thing is being misconstrued in many ways, because now we're seeing that they're predicting that it'll go up to like 88.9% over the next 3 years, right? And so everybody's initial instinct is, oh my gosh, our debt is so high, it's increasing. Like, obviously they must cut spend and like deal with this debt. But no, what we need to be focusing on is how do we grow this economy? How do we, deliver on human rights and grow this economy? But what's happening is we're shrinking that 30%, which is GDP. Government is shrinking their contribution to GDP at a time when the economy at large is shrinking, right? Private sector is shrinking, jobs are being lost, companies are closing, you know what I mean? So it's actually not going to solve our debt issue. And so it really surprised me the other day, S&P wrote that South Africa's budget is a good exercise in showing fiscal control, right? But that we shouldn't expect, that they're not expecting growth from it. So I'm just like, okay, so what exactly are we trying to solve here? So South Africa's not going to grow, but they're going to cut spend. And do you know what the cost of cutting the spend is, right? Like, this is not just a technical thing. It's a political process. It's not just the one and one must balance. It's really about what are the priorities. And I tweeted about this to say, the cost of this fiscal control is literally human lives, right? We've seen umuntu, passing on because of this fundamental decision, right? And so we mustn't take it lightly. It's not about how the world sees us in a way. Like, yes, these things matter, economic topics matter, but fundamentally, you know, the people suffering are going to be us, the majority, you know, Black bodies, Black people, Black women are the ones who are going to suffer. And so debt to me is not the big thing. To me, it's what decisions are we making to resolve the actual issue. Cutting spend will not resolve debt, fundamentally, it won't. So that's where I stand in terms of our debt problems.
Quite scary. From a country that used to be a net exporter and a fairly functional development state to now what we are, a deplorable welfare state. How did we get here? And is there hope even?
I have a lot of debates around this, whether this is a welfare state. I don't think South Africa is a welfare state. And there are multiple reasons for that. The one is that our grants have traditionally taken care of, and actually, let me take this back to say, how our state supports people must be contextualized within the historical, right, social, economic context. You know, and other countries don't necessarily have the same thing, right? Like they don't have the same experiences. You know, when we're dealing with injustice, we're dealing with it in a particular way because of the way that our countries, you know, changed over time, right? And so I don't think it's a welfare state because we've always taken care of the vulnerable, the old, the young, people who actually don't work, right? Children don't work, you know, the elderly don't work, people with disabilities, you know, may not be able to work, right? And so we've traditionally taken care of the most vulnerable groups in our society. I don't think that's a welfare state, right? The new COVID grant is different because obviously it's about unemployment. But again, we need to understand this in a context where unemployment is rapidly rising, you know. We are at a peak. 11.1 million people expanded definition now are without jobs, and over 50%, you know, Black women are out of jobs. And so, you know, we need to think differently about household incomes in South Africa, you know, and yeah, so I think, you know, part of the problems is that we just never had developmental state policies. Let's start there, from gear to all of it, from gear coming all the way, NDP all the way to now. We've never really had developmental state policies. And so, you know, we aren't one because that's not what's happening. I mean, we're seeing everything. There's a private sector led GBVF plan. Can you believe that? Our state is subcontracting the role of protecting Black women
to the private
sector. Like, what is their role? What is the role of the state? Right? Like, so that's actually fundamentally the problem, is that, you know, we are, you know, the role of the state is, you know, being undermined significantly. But also, I think the problem is sometimes people think private sector is, you know, the solution to these things, because private sector is obviously more efficient and all these things. But I think it's always important, you know, my favorite thing is calling out private sector these days. And one of them is to say, in 2015, 54% of working people earned below the working poverty line. So people think jobs are solutions. 54% of working people earned below the working poverty line. This was a 2015 study. So COVID, you know, where are we now? That's also a fundamental thing. We need to understand it better. Where are we now, right? And working poverty line means they're not earning enough to pull themselves and their families out of poverty, right? And so that's actually part of the problem, is that we tell people, like, you know, jobs are the solution. But at the same time, when people have jobs, they're underpaid, undervalued, and so forth. And so it's perpetuating poverty in itself, right? So you've got people who are working literally for transport. That people can't afford, you know, the basic necessities, even though they wake up every day, you know, for themselves and the entire family. So that's the one part of it. It's that notion. But also, on the other end is the problem with this private sector-led thing, recovery, right? Private sector-led infrastructure recovery in particular, is that yeah?
I'm saying solidarity fund-led.
Hey, when like, yo, it's nice to be government in this country. As anyway, so with the private sector-led recovery, there hasn't been adequate engagement with the issues around public-private partnerships, blended finance. And one of my colleagues, Sonia Paladze at my institute, she's written a paper about this, about how de-risking, puts all the risk on government sheets and all the benefits in private sector sheets, right? So fundamentally, our government is saying, we're going to make this risk safer for you, more profitable for you, and yeah, we'll absorb all the risk. But there's also a debt risk with that. That's the thing people don't understand. I keep saying to people, you can't care about debt, but also want a private sector PPP-led recovery. Because what happens, there are countries where it goes sideways, because if your economy rapidly declines, like if we have an economic crisis, right? We're already in an economic crisis, but now imagine there's more lockdowns and stuff. But remember that government is the one who's got this on their bill. They're the ones absorbing the risk. And imagine that like all these projects don't work out. Government absorbs all this risk. So what's going to happen to our debt? You see what I mean? So it's not, yeah, it's almost like what are we trying to solve? Is this going to solve what we're trying to solve? Is a private sector led recovery going to solve our debt issues? Probably no, right? But also just there's a push towards, speaking of developmental states, you'll notice that even Tito Mboweni in the 2018 budget spoke a lot about user fee services. So we're talking more Gautrain like type of public services, so to speak, public services. But people are expected to pay. But how can you expect people to pay in South Africa when there's such high unemployment? 55% of the population lived below the upper bound poverty line in 2015, right? That's probably rapidly increased over this COVID period. How can your whole strategy be around user fees? We're just going to create more of this, Gautrains, which are actually losing profit. Let's start there. And so I just find the entirety of this, the whole economic plan is really not from a developmental state perspective, but also this budget is going to deepen inequality in a very vivid ways, right? Like it's actually going to really deepen inequality. And it's going to take us a long time to recover from what the damage that this budget is going to do to our society and to our people, right? And so, no developmental states capabilities, Lana.
It's quite scary though. Hi, Busi. I think our sound.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, sure. It's quite scary when you look at the budget speech. And you look at the effects on the ordinary person. We've recently seen the strikes by vet students, meaning NSFAS is affected. UNISA also was given an instruction by Blade Zibani to essentially cut first-year entrance. You also look at the health sector that's currently struggling. You look at the mess with the vaccines of COVID. And you also look at social welfare. When I mean social welfare, I mean the grants that you're now saying are essentially going to be cut. You look at the 350 that was given to people. And I'm thinking as far back as the first time I read the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I saw the structural adjustment programs being essentially put into effect. Do you feel that this is where South Africa is now going, where neoliberalism as well as the SAPs are going to be the order of the day?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a self-inflicted structural adjustment program. Literally, we've and it can be quite political. And like I said, austerity is a political decision. It's not just a technical one. And to say that politicals, and there's also many powers, right? The credit ratings agencies are exuding a certain power in South Africa. The IMF, the World Bank, when they write reports around our economy, are exerting a particular power. There's an international power dynamic and there's a domestic power dynamic that are occurring at the same time. And so, yeah, this is basically that. It's been like that for a long time, since 2014, 15, and like I said, there's been the systematic cutting of funding for people, for rights, really, and National Treasury will say there's been no austerity because it's increased by like 1.5%, health increased by like 1.5%, whatever. But guys, there's also population growth. You have to adjust not just for inflation, but also for population growth. And that's how we are defining austerity, right? To say that, is it keeping up with how many people are in your economy and the needs of those people, you know? And so yeah, so we've selected this, because remember the IMF loan that we got last year, as a reminder, to say that it was a particular rapid financing instrument where you're not expected to have an IMF program in your country to get that funding.
Yes.
So we drew up the terms for what we would do. You know, it's not even due for them. It's about the terms of, you know, how we're going to get growth so that we can pay the money back. And effectively, what was put on the table is a structural adjustment program, right? It is a austerity program. It is one where they're going to cut the public sector wage bill, and we see this across many countries, especially in the 80s, when a lot of African countries were forced to implement structural adjustment programs, and that led to a lost decade. You know, so I fundamentally think we're not learning. It's like, yo, guys, economics is difficult, because I think no matter how much evidence there is that this does not work, not many people change the way that they think. And I thought it was very interesting, because the governor of the Reserve Bank yesterday, or 2 days ago, said that, you know, fiscal consolidation, in a way, he was going against what National Treasury is doing. But a couple of years ago, he was the same person saying we need fiscal consolidation. So there's also this flip-flopping of positions where people stand, you know, and I think the luxury of mainstream economics, or, you know, neoliberal economics, is that they've established themselves as the dominant voice. So they never have to feel like they have to be held accountable to their positions, or to defend their positions. Whereas if you're coming from the heterodox or progressive side of economics, you're always having to defend, to like provide the impossible, the evidence, the whatever, you know. And so that's partly the problem. I think, you know, even when we recently participated in these, you know, parliamentary submissions after the budget, you can see the presentations that are given are not speaking to us. We're asking certain questions, we're not getting those answers. We're just getting the budget in a simplified version. Like, that's what they're saying. They're like, you read the budget, we already said what we said. Like, we're not going to defend why we said it. We're just going to say what we said, you know? And so that's why, and I think, you know, to what Gugule has said, we're going to have a lost decade in South Africa. I think I'm increasingly becoming a pessimist, and really starting to believe that. I think, you know, I asked my friends the other day, how many continuous periods of recessions gets you into a depression? Are we in a depression yet? I'm pretty sure we are, right? And it takes very long to get out of a depression. It takes a lot more effort to get out of a depression. So we are certainly in this very difficult place where we haven't learned. I mean, my first paper was about the cost austerity, and it was looking at what countries did after the financial crisis, and people implemented austerity, and it had massive ramifications for human rights and for women in particular. You know, you're frozen.
Am I frozen?
I don't know if you can still hear me.
I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no, you're frozen. So I was like, I don't know if you can still hear me. But you know, so yeah, like, what did we learn from what those countries did? And this is modern history. We're not talking like 1930s. We're talking about over a decade ago, countries did this. And even before COVID, we were still recovering from the global financial crisis. So we're going to do the same things all over again, and expect a different outcome. But also just even, you know, we're talking about these international institutions. I think also just the hypocrisy, you know, what's happening is they're telling the global north to spend as much as they can to, you know, to preserve their economies, to save their people, and they're telling the global south to cut spending, to cut public wage bills, to, you know, and obviously cutting employment in a time where people are rapidly losing employment as well has ramifications for our economy in general, and our households and livelihoods. I don't think an impact assessment on that has even been conducted fundamentally.
I want to zoom into this issue. South Africa is part of the BRICS conglomerate, but I do not see us taking any notes or following a particular policy position, which perhaps post 2008, when the global recession hit us, has assured that certain economies thrive, even post-COVID lockdowns, What are we not learning from our BRICS counterparts?
Do we ever learn? I'm convinced I don't think we learn. I don't think we learn. Yeah, you know what? With COVID, there's many things. The one is, I think, the introduction of the special grant was very important. It was, their government showed us that, they can, they can. But there's also other concerning things. When we calculated our, the government has been priding itself in having one of the largest responses, 10% of GDP, so forth, right? But actually, in reality, when we analyzed it, only 36 billion or 45 billion actually was new money. So that was only the stimulus. So it was actually only in terms of new money. Let's think about it that way. Money being spent on the budget only. I'm going to talk about the budget only. It was only 1% increase in our budget, right? And then,
only 1%.
Only 1%, because remember the 200 billion for the loans is an off budget. It's with the South African Reserve Bank. The UIF and TERS is its own thing. What our government took out of its pocket from our budget side was only 1%, right? And when we actually assessed, of the 500 billion that was announced, how much has been utilized to date, we found before the SONA that it was only a third of that money had been utilized.
Wow.
Or the resources had been utilized. So massive underutilization of the emergency rescue package, which we would argue was not even large enough to begin with.
Yes.
For given the size of the crisis itself. A lot of underutilization of the credit facility because of all the barriers to accessing the funds. So we're literally having businesses fall off, dying, even though there's supposed to be this facility. Municipalities are literally going bankrupt. We actually needed to think about how do we bail them out? Can we allow municipalities to fail? I think not enough was even given to municipalities. The front line of service delivery is our municipalities, and not enough. Only 20 billion, remember, was allocated to municipal spending. Like, you can't resolve South Africa's inequalities, water access, all these issues, water and sanitation, which was a major thing for combating COVID itself. You can't think 20 billion is going to make up for the deep inequalities that exist in such a short period of time. And so, yeah, I think in theory, the 500 billion supposedly could look good to somebody else. I would even accept 500 billion at that point. But in practice, it really wasn't. It was the 500 billion that never was. And our government has decided to skip. We are in recovery phase. They've decided that we are now in recovery phase. And so they can withdraw the support. The 350 is ending, right, in April. They can withdraw these supports. But we're not out of the crisis. We're still in the emergency. COVID is not over, right? We're talking about third wave in June, but there could be a fourth wave, a fifth wave, a sixth wave, we don't know, 10th wave, I don't know. But also fundamentally, vaccination is not cure.
Yes.
That's also the other thing people need to understand. Vaccination is not a cure. So you can't move to recovery without rescue. There will be no recovery without rescue. And the government's decided to just jump from emergency to recovery with that. And the rescue is the foundation for recovery. And we've done poorly at creating this foundation, very poorly. And so it's calling for new tools, but are they open to them? Probably they're not. We're calling for a universal basic income grant for, people between 18 and 59, because acknowledging that we're still in crisis, but also fundamentally every human being should have the right to basic goods, to the basics of life. Do you know what I mean? Just the basics, to say that every South African should have the basics. I mean, look at mining companies. They're making a killing with their profit because of the commodity prices. Guys, I feel like if we put a resource rent tax to, we could go a long way. We could go a long way here. You know what I mean? So it's thinking differently about what are your priorities? What are the priorities of our government and what will they do? What tools will they use to deliver on what our needs are, as opposed to telling us there's no budget and think from this small space. I think we need to do it the opposite way. What do we need? And how do we get here? As opposed to, this is where we are, everything is terrible, so we can only give less. That is not a solution. That's a non-solution. That's thinking small because you're constraining yourself so much, as opposed to thinking, what is our goal and how to arrive there? So yeah.
Scary stuff.
That's that on BRICS. Oh.
I want to quickly zoom to the issue or ideas around SOEs. One, the question I have is, we're looking at the wholesale dysfunction as well as the seeming privatization. The stream is everything is going to be privatized eventually. I want to ask, is this the right way of improving the state of our SOEs or even assisting government with additional funding or budget?
I don't believe in privatization, generally, from a general perspective. I think, to privatize, it's that question, go back to that question, the beginning, what I said at the beginning, what is the role of state? What must, and I don't think we've honestly answered, like for us to decide which SOE stay or go, you need to fundamentally answer the question of what must the state provide and what must private sector provide?
Yes.
Electricity, the state must provide, right? To me, that's a no-brainer. The state must provide electricity. I mean, ideally we want clean energy. That's actually where they should be moving towards, because that's important as well, right? For our environmental justice, but also just like our right to a healthy environment, that's a right as well. But I think in terms of, so again, it's that question of what is the issue that you're trying to solve? I think sometimes there's always this assumption that private sector is more efficient, is better run and whatnot. It's in a way, it's a misnomer in many ways, right? Because there's also a lot of private sector companies that are run poorly, that are, but nobody really cares about them because they just fall off. It's not the state in a way. The state is held to a different expectation. Ideally, you want a state that does the work well, that runs SOEs well, that, I think sometimes people have a wrong impression of what SOEs are meant to do. SOEs are not meant to be profit-making mechanisms, right? Because their function is to provision public goods. It's nice if they make a profit, but actually what we should be aiming for is break even, because they're providing essential services to people. They're not profit-making. They're not businesses in a sense that they're not profit maximizing, cost reducing, exploitative machines. Let's if you're going to lay it like that. So also our understanding of what our SOEs are supposed to be making and stuff are also just flawed in that way. Because for me, it would be, are they at least breaking even? Are they provisioning the service? Are they breaking even? Can they be self-sufficient? We don't want them on office because like we've been having over the last couple of years. We don't want to be holding all these contingent liabilities. We want them to afford their own debt servicing costs and pay them, and so, so it's again, it's always that question of, what must the state provide? What is the role of the state? If you believe in a small role of the state, then obviously privatization is a solution because it just limits the role of the states. And so I've said this quite a bit to say, economists think they're debating policy, but what we're fundamentally debating is the role of the state. If you look at it deeper, that's what we're actually debating. So, and people will have like neoliberal solutions for some things, but then for some things they want like Marxist approaches. And I'm just like, okay, consistency, can we, because if you believe the role of the state is to provision something, you should always believe that regardless of the context. It can't be like in this context, yes, but in that one, no, So I think, there's just a lot of contradiction, even in our own economic policies around, collectively, what are we saying the role of the state is? What is this budget saying the role of the state is,
As part of our conclusion, maybe briefly just brush over the letter that was submitted by the 200 plus organizations. Key takeaways that perhaps some of us weren't aware were mentioned in the budget speech, which essentially rendered it anti-poor and pro-business, as a concluding remark.
Yeah. So yeah, no, we called for, so obviously the budget was on the 24th, and afterwards the finance committee meets, the select and standing committee on finance, which effectively, are the ones who give feedback to, they're the parliamentarians who basically look at the budget and approve it or not. And we called for it to be rejected, and on the basis that it was going to regress human rights. It's been signed by trade unions, it's been signed by a lot of NGOs, it's been signed by a lot of individuals, basically calling for this budget to be rejected. It was passed, unfortunately, 2 days ago. The budget itself has been passed, even though, we called out some of the key issues, and I'll highlight some of them here. We spoke about, the over the 18 million people who need or rely on social grants, and how the 10 Rand increases are below the inflation. We spoke about the cuts to primary healthcare services and to public hospitals, while 300,000 people will not receive access to ARVs. So there's also budgets that are being cut, like the ARV, program, the HIV and AIDS program is being, reduced expenditure in that area. So we basically said that it's cutting on the government, or rescinding on government's call, or rather the Constitution's promise to improve the quality of life for all. And I'll just give you some of the sectors we highlight in cuts. We say, there's 265 billion worth of cuts over the next 3 years. 67.2 billion is going to be cut from public health spending, right? 36 billion to be cut from social grants, because obviously they're not increasing them in real terms, right? And 9 billion being taken away from public schools. And this is in addition to COVID, right? Remember, because of the crisis, schools have been in crisis in a particular way. There's actually some emerging research around how long it will take for schools to recover, in terms of the students, the students they're producing, how long is it going to recover from this last year of education, yet we are cutting that spend. And we basically say, government will be spending 2,700 Rand less per person in the next few years.
Scary stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's a script for a film. It sounds more like a script for a horror film more than anything.
That's what I said. I said we are living in a nightmare. We are literally living in a nightmare.
It's quite scary. It's scary though, because most colleagues from Africa, wherever I go, they're all of the impression and assumption that SA is thriving and alive and kicking. And the reality is SA is not.
It's really nuts. It's that, I love that. It's like, when you were the it thing in high school, you were the popular kid in high school, and everyone still has that impression that you are the popular kid. Like, you must have blown up because, wow, and then it's actually like, no, you went to varsity, and varsity kicked your butt, and now you're failing your classes, and you were like the top scholar in high school, but now you're failing literally your classes and stuff. That's literally us.
Wow. Busi Sibeko, it's a pleasure engaging with you, and thank you so much for unpacking these critical and needful issues that the budget speech obviously spoke about, but nobody gave us a chance to engage further and understand how it then translates to the ordinary human being on the streets. Just like you rightfully stated, SA before COVID and even post 94 was already on its knees. But after this budget speech, we now know for certain that South Africa has become a client state. We have become a neoliberal project of the Bretton Woods institutions. And one wonders where to from here. But for what you've shared with us, thank you so much. I'm going to be playing you out with Sun El musician. The song is called Ubomi Abumanga. Next, I'm going to follow with...
I hope so.
After that, I'm going to be playing Wizkid featuring Burna Boy. The song is called Ginger. After that, hopefully, if time permits, I'm going to play Tupac Changes. And then closing off, I'm going to be playing Michael Jackson, They Don't Care About Us. Thank you so much, Busi. You take care.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.